The millionaire saved a young woman hitchhiking in the rain, but he didn't know she was his long-lost daughter. The deafening roar of the engine echoed through the cabin of the Lamborghini Aventador as Alexander Jordan cut through the streets of Seattle like a bolt of golden lightning. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the white knuckles contrasting with the black leather. His green eyes, normally calculating, were now clouded with rage. "Damn you, Donovan!" he growled, punching the dashboard of the luxury car. The meeting with his longtime rival had not gone as planned. Once again, Preston Donovan had managed to close a deal right under his nose. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to calm down. At 45, he was one of the richest and most powerful men in Washington, the owner of a technology empire that rivaled the giants of Silicon Valley. But at that moment, he felt like a powerless kid, unable to overcome his archenemy from college. As he struggled to control his emotions, the Seattle sky opened up in a furious torrent. The rain pelted the windshield with an intensity that made the drops look like liquid bullets. Alexander cursed softly, slowing down. The last thing he needed was to crash his $500,000 car. It was then that he saw her. A small figure on the side of the road, soaking wet and shivering. Even through the curtain of rain, Alexander could tell that it was a child, a girl perhaps, with her arms raised in a silent plea for help. For a moment, he hesitated. It wasn't in his nature to stop for strangers, much less on a night like this. But something about the scene touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Before he could rationalize his decision, Alexander was already braking and pulling over to the side of the road. The girl ran towards the car, her footsteps making wet noises on the asphalt. Alexander lowered the window a few centimeters, just enough to hear her thin, trembling voice. "Please, sir, can you give me a lift? I got lost." Alexander studied her for a moment. She must have been no more than 10 years old, with dark brown hair stuck to her face by the rain and deep blue eyes that seemed familiar somehow. Her clothes, a flowery dress and a denim jacket, were completely soaked. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. The girl looked down, her shoulders drooping visibly. I don't know. I came to Seattle with my adoptive mother, but we got separated downtown and I couldn't find her." Alexander felt a twinge in his chest. Adoptive. The word echoed in his mind, bringing up memories he had buried long ago. "Come in," he said, unlocking the doors. "We're going to try and find your mother." The girl hesitated for a second, as if remembering the warnings about not getting into strangers' cars. But the merciless rain and Alexander's gentle gaze seemed to convince her. She opened the door and slid into the leather seat, leaving a puddle of water at her feet. "What's your name?" asked Alexander, turning the heater on full blast. "Skylar," she replied, her teeth still chattering from the cold. "Skylar Matthews." "Nice to meet you, Skylar. I'm Alexander." He offered a reassuring smile. "Now, tell me, where was the last time you saw your mother?" As Skylar began to describe the place where she was separated from her adoptive mother, Alexander couldn't help but notice the familiar features on her face, the shape of her eyes, her delicate chin. He shook his head, pushing away absurd thoughts. It was just a coincidence, nothing more. "I think I know where it is," he said, maneuvering the car back onto the road. "We'll find it, don't worry." As they drove in silence, Alexander cast furtive glances at his young passenger. There was something about her that intrigued him, that moved him in a way he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in her eyes, or the courage she showed in asking a stranger for help. "So, Skylar," he broke the silence, trying to distract both the girl and himself. "Do you like Seattle?" Skylar shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's different from where I used to live. Bigger, noisier. But there are nice places." "Where did you live before?" "In a small town in Oregon. There wasn't much to do there, but it was quiet." She paused, her eyes taking on a distant glow. "Sometimes I miss it." Alexander nodded, understanding. Change can be hard, especially when you're young. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. Have you been with your adoptive mother for long?" The question seemed to take Skylar by surprise. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat before answering. For 2 years now. Before that, I was in an orphanage. Alexander's heart squeezed. 2 years. Exactly the time that had passed since... No, he couldn't think about that now. I'm sorry, he mumbled, not knowing exactly what he was apologizing for. Skylar shrugged again, a gesture that seemed to be her shield against the world. It's all right. Mrs. Matthews is nice. She treats me well. Alexander wanted to ask more, to know more about the life of this girl who, for some inexplicable reason, fascinated him. But he held back. It wasn't his place, after all. They continued their journey in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The rain began to fall, and the city lights shone through the drops on the windshield, creating a kaleidoscope of colors. Finally, they arrived at the place Skylar had described. It was a busy square, full of stores and cafes. Even with the bad weather, there were still a good number of people walking around, protected by colorful umbrellas. "Do you see your mother anywhere?" asked Alexander, slowing down and scanning the crowd. Skylar pressed her face against the glass, her eyes frantically scanning the people on the sidewalk. Suddenly, she let out a cry of joy. "There! It's her!" Alexander followed the girl's gaze and saw a middle-aged woman standing under the awning of a store, her face a mask of worry as she looked anxiously around. He barely had time to stop the car before Skylar opened the door and jumped out, running towards the woman. "Mrs. Matthews! Mrs. Matthews!" The woman turned when she heard her name, and her face lit up with relief when she saw Skylar. She opened her arms and the girl threw herself into them, the two of them hugging tightly. Alexander watched the scene with a mixture of emotions he couldn't decipher. Joy at having helped reunite Skylar with her adoptive mother, for sure. But there was something else, a twinge of sadness, perhaps even envy. He saw Mrs. Matthews look in his direction, gratitude evident on her face. Alexander nodded briefly, a polite smile on his lips. Part of him wanted to get out of the car, introduce himself, perhaps exchange a few words. But something kept him pinned to the seat. As he watched Skylar and her foster mother drive away, chatting animatedly, Alexander felt a strange sensation settle in his chest. It was as if he was letting something important slip away, as if he was missing a unique chance. Shaking his head to clear away these confusing thoughts, he started the engine again. It had been a strange night, full of unexpected emotions. All he wanted now was to get home, have a drink, and try to forget Skylar's blue eyes that seemed to haunt him. But as he maneuvered the car back onto the main street, Alexander couldn't help but take one last look at the place where Skylar had disappeared. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like if things had been different, if fate had taken a different course. With a heavy sigh, he stepped on the accelerator. The night was just beginning, and something told him that his life was about to change in a way he could never have predicted. Alexander Jordan entered his penthouse apartment with heavy steps, his mind still reeling from the night's events. The luxurious space, with its panoramic view of Seattle, usually made him feel on top of the world. Today, however, it felt empty and cold. He went straight to the bar, pouring himself a generous shot of 30-year-old whiskey. The amber liquid burned his throat, but he couldn't erase the image of Skylar from his thoughts. "What the hell is happening to me?" he muttered to himself, running his hand through the gray hair at his temples. His gaze wandered to a framed photo on the shelf. He and Catherine, his ex-wife, smiling on a beach over a decade ago, before everything fell apart, before the tragedy that separated them forever. With a heavy sigh, Alexander picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Hello?" The sleepy voice on the other end of the line made him hesitate. "Catherine, it's Alex." There was a tense pause before she answered. "Alexander? It's almost 2 in the morning. What happened?" He took a deep breath. "Sorry about the time. I need to ask you something. About that night." The silence that followed was almost palpable. When Catherine spoke again, her voice was charged with restrained emotion. "Alex, We agreed not to talk about it. It's too late to— I know, he interrupted her, his voice softer than usual. But something happened today, and I need to know. That night, when we lost our daughter, are you absolutely sure that she— Stop, Catherine whispered, her voice broken. Please don't do this. Don't reopen that wound. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of years of guilt and regret. I'm sorry, Kate. It's just, I met a girl today. She's the age our daughter would have been. And there's something about her that— Alex, Catherine interrupted him, her voice now firm. Our daughter is gone. Whatever you're thinking, stop. Don't torture yourself like this. Don't torture us. He nodded, forgetting that she couldn't see him. You're right. I'm sorry to call so late. Good night, Kate. Before she could reply, Alexander hung up. He stood there for a moment, the phone still in his hand, feeling more lost than ever. The next morning, Alexander woke up with a throbbing headache, a reminder of the previous night's whiskey. As he got ready for work, he decided that he needed to put Skylar out of his mind. It was just a coincidence, nothing more. Arriving at the Jordan Technologies office, he plunged into work, determined to concentrate on business and forget the events of the night before. But even as he reviewed contracts and took part in video conferences, his thoughts kept returning to the blue-eyed girl. Mr. Jordan? His assistant's voice snapped him out of his reverie. There's a call on line 2. It's the social worker from the Department of Children's Services. Alexander frowned, confused. Social worker? There must be some mistake. She insists it's urgent, sir. With a resigned sigh, he took the call. Alexander Jordan speaking. Mr. Jordan, my name is Samantha Ortiz, from the Seattle Department of Children's Services. I'm calling about Skylar Matthews. Alexander's heart leapt. Skylar? What happened? Is she okay? There was a pause on the other end of the line before Samantha continued. Mr. Jordan, we need you in our office as soon as possible. There are complications with Skylar's situation, and your name came up during our investigation. My name? What do you mean? I only met her last night when— Please, Mr. Jordan, Samantha interrupted him gently. It would be best if we discussed this in person. When could you come to our office? Alexander looked at his busy schedule. On any other day, he would have said he was too busy, but something deep inside him urged him to act. I'll be there in an hour, he replied, standing up and grabbing his jacket. The drive to the Department of Children's Services seemed to take forever. Alexander's mind was buzzing with possibilities. What could have happened, and how was his name involved? When he arrived at the building, he was immediately ushered into a meeting room. Inside, he met Samantha Ortiz, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, and, to his surprise, Mrs. Matthews. Mr. Jordan, thank you for coming so quickly, Samantha began, indicating a chair for him. We have a delicate situation on our hands. Mrs. Matthews looked as if she'd been crying recently, her eyes red and swollen. She cast an anxious glance at Alexander before turning her attention to the social worker. What's going on? Alexander asked, sensing the tension in the air. Samantha took a deep breath before beginning. Mr. Jordan, after the incident last night, Skylar mentioned your name to Ms. Matthews. That raised some questions about Skylar's past. What kind of questions? The social worker exchanged a glance with Mrs. Matthews before continuing. Mr. Jordan, how long have you known Skylar? Alexander frowned. I met her last night when I found her hitchhiking in the rain. Why? And you've never seen her before. You have no previous connection with her. No, What's this all about? It was Mrs. Matthews who spoke then, her voice trembling slightly. Skylar is not my biological daughter, Mr. Jordan. I adopted her 2 years ago, after she was found, abandoned. Alexander's heart seemed to stop for a moment. Abandoned? Samantha nodded gravely. Skylar was found in a park in Portland, Oregon, just over 2 years ago. There was no information about her biological parents, and all attempts to locate her family were unsuccessful. Alexander felt the world spin around him. 2 years ago, Portland. It couldn't be a coincidence. But what does this have to do with me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Jordan, Samantha said softly. When Skylar talked about you last night, she mentioned that there was something familiar in your eyes, something that made her feel at home. Mrs. Matthews sobbed softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Alexander felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Are you suggesting that Skylar could be— We're not suggesting anything yet, Mr. Jordan, Samantha said quickly, but given the circumstances, we believe it would be prudent to carry out a DNA test. Alexander leaned back in his chair, stunned. Memories of a terrible night 10 years ago flooded his mind. The cry of a baby, the sound of screeching tires, a scream from Catherine, and then silence. Where's Skylar now? He asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. She's in an adjoining room with one of our counselors, Samantha replied. Mr. Jordan, we understand that this is a lot to process, but we need to know. Are you willing to take the DNA test? Alexander looked at Mrs. Matthews, seeing the fear and uncertainty in her eyes. Then he thought of Skylar, the brave girl who had gotten into his car on the rainy night, trusting a stranger to help her. With his heart pounding in his chest, he nodded slowly. Yes, he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. I'll take the test. As Samantha began to explain the process, Alexander couldn't help thinking about how his life had completely changed in less than 24 hours. The man who had walked into that office was not the same man who was now contemplating the possibility of being the father of a baby girl he thought he had lost a decade ago. Whatever the outcome, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. And for the first time in years, Alexander Jordan felt a spark of hope ignite in his heart. The days following the meeting at the Department of Children's Services were a blur for Alexander Jordan. The DNA test had been carried out, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the results. The wait was agonizing, each minute seeming to drag on for an eternity. Alexander tried to concentrate on his work, immersing himself in endless projects and meetings at Jordan Technologies. But his thoughts inevitably wandered to Skylar and the possibilities that the future could bring. A week after the test, his phone rang. It was Samantha Ortiz. Mr. Jordan, she said, her voice carefully neutral. The results are in. Could you come to our office this afternoon? Alexander felt his heart racing. I'll be there in an hour, he replied, getting up from his chair. The drive to the Department of Children's Services seemed even longer this time. Alexander tried to mentally prepare himself for all the possibilities, but the truth was that he didn't know what to expect or what to want. When he arrived, he was ushered into the same meeting room as before. Samantha was already waiting for him, along with Mrs. Matthews and a man he didn't recognize, probably a lawyer. Mr. Jordan, Samantha began as soon as he sat down. Thank you for coming so quickly. As I said, the results of the DNA test have arrived. Alexander nodded, unable to form words. His gaze met that of Mrs. Matthews, who seemed as anxious as he was. Samantha opened a folder in front of her and took a deep breath before continuing. The results show a 99.9% match. Mr. Jordan, Skylar is indeed your biological daughter. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Alexander felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. His daughter, Skylar, was his daughter. The girl he thought he had lost 10 years ago was alive, and he had found her by chance on a rainy night. How is this possible? He finally managed to ask, his voice laced with emotion. The lawyer leaned forward. Mr. Jordan, we understand that this is an extremely delicate situation. There are many questions that need to be answered, and legal processes to be followed. Mrs. Matthews sobbed softly, and Alexander felt a pang of guilt. She had looked after Skylar for 2 years, loving her like her own daughter. And now? What happens now? Alexander asked, looking from Samantha to the lawyer. Well, Samantha began, legally, you have rights as Skylar's biological father. However, the situation is complicated by Mrs. Matthews' adoption. We'll have to go through a court process to determine custody and visitation rights. Alexander nodded slowly, trying to process everything. What about Skylar? Does she know? Not yet, replied Samantha. We thought it best to discuss it with you first before broaching the subject with her. Skylar has been through a lot in the last few years, and we want to ensure that any transition is as least traumatic as possible for her." Mrs. Matthews spoke for the first time since Alexander had arrived. "I love Skylar as if she were my own daughter. I don't want to lose her, but she deserves to know the truth about her origins." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. "Mrs. Matthews, I don't know what to say. I have no intention of taking Skylar away from you. She's clearly had a good life in your care. It's commendable that you're both thinking about Skylar's well-being. However, there are many legal aspects to consider. I suggest that you both hire legal representation to navigate this process." Alexander barely heard the rest of the meeting. His mind was focused on one thing. He had a daughter. Skylar was alive, and somehow fate had brought them together. Leaving the office, Alexander found himself walking aimlessly through the streets of Seattle. The city continued its frenetic routine around him, but for him, the world had changed forever. Without thinking, he found himself calling the one person he needed to share this news with. "Catherine, it's Alex again. I need to see you. It's about our daughter." Half an hour later, Alexander was sitting in a discreet cafe, waiting anxiously. When Catherine walked in, he almost didn't recognize her. The years had been kind to her, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Alex," she said, taking a seat opposite him. "What's going on? You scared me off the phone." He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Kate, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just say it. Our daughter is alive." Catherine paled, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What? Alex, this isn't funny. If this is some kind of cruel joke—" "It's not a joke," he interrupted her gently. "I found you, Kate, by chance. She's 10 now, and her name is Skylar." Over the next few minutes, Alexander told Catherine everything. The meeting in the rain, the call from the Department of Children's Services, the DNA test. As he spoke, he saw a myriad of emotions cross his ex-wife's face. Shock, disbelief, hope, and finally, a mixture of joy and deep sorrow. "My God, Alex," Catherine whispered when he had finished, tears streaming down her face. "Our baby. She's alive. All those years." Alexander reached out and took Catherine's hand. It was the first genuine contact between them in years. "I know. I can hardly believe it either. I want to see her," Catherine said, her voice steady despite her tears. "We need to see her, Alex." He nodded. "Yes, but it's complicated. She was adopted. She has a family now." Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, processing the information. When she opened them again, there was a fierce determination in them. "It doesn't matter. She's our daughter. We'll do whatever it takes." As they discussed the next steps, Alexander found himself thinking about how life could change so drastically in such a short space of time. Just a few weeks ago, he was a solitary man, focused only on his career and outdoing his rivals in business. Now, he was a newfound father, about to embark on a journey to reconnect with the daughter he thought he had lost. The coffee cooled on the table, forgotten, as they planned and dreamed. For the first time in a decade, Alexander and Catherine were united by a common purpose, their daughter. When they finally said goodbye hours later, there was a sense of hope in the air. The future was uncertain, full of legal and emotional challenges. But for the first time in a long time, both Alexander and Catherine felt they had something to fight for. As he walked back to his office, Alexander looked up at the Seattle sky. The clouds that usually covered the city had dissipated, revealing a bright blue sky. He couldn't help but think it was a sign, a new beginning, a chance to right the wrongs of the past and build a future he never imagined possible. With a smile on his lips, Alexander picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the week," he instructed. "I have urgent personal matters to attend to." For the first time in years, business could wait. Now, his priority was Skylar, his daughter, his unexpected miracle. And he would do everything in his power to be present in her life, no matter what obstacles he had to face. The law firm Goldstein Associates occupied the entire 35th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Seattle. Alexander Jordan adjusted his tie as the elevator went up, trying to calm his nerves. Next to him, Catherine seemed equally tense, her fingers drumming incessantly on the strap of her handbag. The doors opened, revealing an elegant and modern reception area. A young woman greeted them with a professional smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Jordan, Dr. Goldstein is waiting for you." "Actually, it's Mrs. Harper now," Catherine corrected softly, casting a sidelong glance at Alexander. The receptionist blushed slightly. "I apologize, Mrs. Harper. This way, please." They were ushered into a conference room with a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline. Sitting at the head of the table was Evelyn Goldstein, one of Washington State's most respected family law attorneys. "Mr. Jordan, Ms. Harper," Evelyn greeted them, indicating the chairs. "Thank you for coming. I understand that we're dealing with a rather unique—" Alexander nodded, taking a seat. "Dr. Goldstein, thank you for seeing us on such short notice. As you can imagine, we're anxious to understand our options." Evelyn opened a folder in front of her. "Well, after reviewing the documents you sent me and doing some preliminary research, I can tell you that we have a complex case on our hands. Mrs. Matthews' adoption of Skylar was legal and binding. However, the fact that you were not informed or gave consent to this adoption gives us some room to maneuver." Catherine leaned forward, her voice quivering with emotion. "What does that mean exactly? Can we have our daughter back?" Evelyn took a deep breath before answering. "Mrs. Harper, Mr. Jordan, I need to be clear here. Legally, Skylar is Mrs. Matthews' daughter. Undoing an adoption is an extremely rare and complicated process. In addition, we need to consider the emotional impact this would have on Skylar." Alexander felt his heart sink. "So there's nothing we can do?" "I wouldn't say that," Evelyn replied, a slight smile on her lips. "What we can do is file for visitation rights and, potentially, shared custody. Given that you are the biological parents and that there was no intentional abandonment of the child, we have a solid case." Catherine and Alexander exchanged glances. It was less than they expected, but more than they feared. "And what would the next steps be?" Alexander asked. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "First, we need to file a petition with the family court. That will start the legal process. In parallel, I suggest we try a mediation approach with Mrs. Matthews. If we can reach an amicable agreement, it will be better for everyone involved, especially Skylar." "What about Skylar?" Catherine asked, her voice laden with concern. "When will we be able to see her? How are we going to explain all this to her?" Evelyn's expression softened. "That's the tricky part. I suggest we work with a child psychologist to determine the best way to broach the subject with Skylar. As for seeing her, legally, we'll have to wait for court approval or Mrs. Matthews' consent." Alexander felt a wave of frustration, so close, and yet so far from his daughter. What if Mrs. Matthews doesn't agree to mediation? What if she fights us every step of the way? Evelyn looked directly at them. "Then we'll be prepared to fight. But I strongly advise that we try a collaborative approach first. Remember, Skylar's well-being must be our top priority." The meeting continued for another hour, with Evelyn explaining in detail every stage of the legal process that awaited them. When they finally left the office, Alexander and Catherine were emotionally exhausted. "Coffee?" Alexander suggested, pointing to a coffee shop across the street. Catherine nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Minutes later, they were sitting at a corner table, cups steaming in front of them. "It's a lot to process," Catherine muttered, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. Alexander nodded in agreement. "Yes, but at least we have a plan now, a way forward." Catherine looked out of the window, watching the pedestrians hurrying along the sidewalk. "Alex, do you think we're doing the right thing? What if we're just disrupting Skylar's life?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Alexander took a moment to answer, choosing his words carefully. "Kate, honestly, I don't know. But what I do know is that Skylar is our daughter. We spent 10 years believing that we had lost her forever. Now that we know she's alive, I can't just move on as if nothing had happened. She deserves to know the truth about her origins, and we deserve the chance to be a part of her life." Catherine nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes. "You're right. It's just, I'm so scared. What if she hates us for not meeting her sooner? What if she'd rather just stay with Mrs. Matthews?" Alexander reached out, taking Catherine's hand. "Then we'll deal with it when the time comes. Together." The gesture of comfort, so familiar and yet so strange after years of distance, brought a tremulous smile to Catherine's lips. For a moment, it was as if the years of separation and hurt had disappeared, replaced by a common purpose. "Together," she repeated, squeezing his hand. As they finished their coffees, they discussed the next steps. Alexander would call Samantha Ortiz at the Department of Children's Services to inform her of his legal plans. Catherine would research child psychologists specializing in family reunification. As they said goodbye in front of the cafeteria, there was a new energy between them, a shared determination they hadn't felt in years. "Keep me informed about everything," Catherine said, adjusting the strap of her handbag. Alexander nodded. "I will. And Kate, thank you for being here. I don't think I could have done it on my own." She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her eyes. "Neither do I, Alex." "Me neither." As they walked in opposite directions, they both felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. The road ahead would be difficult, full of legal and emotional obstacles. But for the first time in a decade, Alexander and Catherine had a glimpse of the future they thought they had lost forever. Back in his office, Alexander found a pile of documents awaiting his signature and dozens of unread emails. But for the first time in years, business seemed insignificant compared to what really mattered. He picked up the phone and dialed Samantha Ortiz's number. As he waited for her to pick up, his eyes fell on a photo on her desk, himself, 10 years younger, holding a trophy for Entrepreneur of the Year. At the time, it had seemed like the most important achievement of his life. Now, he knew that his greatest achievement was yet to come, winning back the love and trust of the daughter he barely knew. Department of Children's Services, Samantha Ortiz speaking. Alexander took a deep breath. "Mrs. Ortiz, it's Alexander Jordan. We need to talk about Skylar." As she began to explain her plans, Alexander felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. His life would never be the same again. And for the first time in a long time, he was eager to see what tomorrow would bring. Volunteer Park was bustling that Saturday afternoon. Families were picnicking on the grass, children were running and shouting happily, and couples were strolling hand in hand along the winding paths. For Alexander Jordan, however, the world seemed to have slowed to a near standstill. He was sitting on a worn wooden bench, his hands clasped together to stop them from shaking. Next to him, Catherine looked equally nervous, her eyes constantly scanning the crowd. "She should be here by now," murmured Catherine, checking her watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. Alexander nodded silently. After weeks of negotiations, mediations, and psychological preparations, the day had finally come. They were going to meet Skylar, officially, as her biological parents. Mrs. Matthews had reluctantly agreed to a supervised meeting in the park. Samantha Ortiz would be there, along with Dr. Rachel Chen, the child psychologist who had been assigned to help Skylar process this huge change in her life. Suddenly, Catherine grabbed Alexander's arm. "There," she whispered, her voice tinged with emotion. Alexander followed her gaze and his heart almost stopped. Walking along the gravel path was Mrs. Matthews, holding the hand of a little brown-haired girl. Skylar, Samantha, and Dr. Chen followed closely behind. As they approached, Alexander felt a whirlwind of emotions: joy, fear, hope, guilt. Skylar seemed nervous, clinging to Mrs. Matthews' hand as if it were a lifebuoy. "Mr. Jordan, Mrs. Harper," Samantha greeted when they reached the bench. "Skylar, this is Alexander and Catherine. Do you remember what we talked about?" Skylar nodded shyly, her big blue eyes, Catherine's eyes, Alexander noticed with a squeeze in his heart. studying them curiously. "Hello, Skylar," Catherine said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "It's so good to see you." Alexander tried to speak, but found that his throat was too dry. Instead, he offered a shaky smile, hoping that his eyes conveyed everything his heart wanted to say. Dr. Chen stepped forward. "Skylar, why don't we show Alexander and Catherine that big oak tree you like? We can talk there for a while." Skylar looked at Mrs. Matthews, who nodded encouragingly. "It's all right, dear. I'll be right here if you need me." Slowly, the group made their way to the towering tree a few meters ahead. Dr. Chen skillfully guided the conversation, asking simple questions to break the ice. "So, Skylar," she began, "do you like this park?" Skylar nodded, relaxing a little. "Yes, I come here with Mom. With Mrs. Matthews, almost every weekend." Alexander and Catherine exchanged glances. Hearing Skylar refer to someone else as Mom hurt, but they knew they had to be patient. "And what do you like doing here the most?" Alexander asked, finally finding his voice. Skylar looked at him, a small smile appearing on her lips. "I like climbing this tree. You can see the lake from up there." Catherine laughed softly. "You know, when I was your age, I loved climbing trees too. My parents used to drive me crazy." That seemed to catch Skylar's interest. "Really? Have you ever fallen?" And so the conversation flowed more easily. Skylar shared stories about school, her friends, her pet dog called Biscuit. Alexander and Catherine drank up every word, every gesture, every smile, like a thirsty man in the desert. As Skylar talked about her love of drawing, Alexander couldn't help but notice how she frowned in concentration, just like he did. Catherine, for her part, recognized her own laughter in Skylar's. As the afternoon progressed, the initial tension dissipated. In a particularly relaxed moment, Skylar even allowed Catherine to help her up a low branch of the oak tree. "Wow, the view is incredible from here," exclaimed Skylar, her eyes shining with excitement. Catherine smiled, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. "It really is, darling. It really is." Alexander watched the scene, his heart overflowing with emotion. For a brief moment, he could imagine what it would have been like if things had been different, if they'd had the chance to raise Skylar from scratch. But then, reality set in again. Mrs. Matthews approached, indicating that it was time to go. Skylar's face contracted in a mixture of confusion and sadness. "Do we have to go yet?" she asked, looking from Alexander and Catherine to Mrs. Matthews. Dr. Chen intervened gently. "Yes, Skylar, but remember, this is only the beginning. There will be more encounters like this." Skylar nodded slowly, climbing down from the tree with Alexander's help. She hesitated for a moment, then, to everyone's surprise, hugged Catherine briefly. "Bye," she murmured, before running back to Mrs. Matthews. Catherine stood paralyzed, tears streaming freely down her face now. Alexander put an arm around her shoulders, offering silent support. As they watched Skylar walk away, Alexander felt a bittersweet mixture of joy and pain. The meeting had been better than he had dared to hope, but it had also served as a cruel reminder of everything they had lost. "How do you think it went?" he asked Samantha, who was standing nearby. She offered an encouraging smile. "I think it was a great start, Mr. Jordan. Skylar seemed comfortable and open. That's more than we could have hoped for a first date." Dr. Chen agreed. "Skylar is a resilient and intelligent child. She'll need time to process all this, but I'm optimistic." Alexander nodded, grateful for the positive feedback. He looked at Catherine, who was still wiping away her tears. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Catherine took a deep breath before answering. "Yeah, I guess. It's just, she's so amazing, Alex. And we've lost so much." "I know," he murmured, feeling the weight of those words. "But now we have a chance to be part of her life. It's not everything, but it's something." They stood there for a long moment, watching the spot where Skylar had disappeared from view. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the park. "What happens now?" Catherine asked, finally breaking the silence. Samantha stepped forward. Well, we'll continue with the supervised meetings for now. If everything continues to go well, we can gradually increase the frequency and duration. Alexander nodded, his mind already planning the next steps. What about the legal process? We'll continue with mediation, Samantha replied. Mrs. Matthews seems to be more open to a settlement after seeing how positive today's meeting was for Schuyler. As they walked back to the parking lot, Alexander and Catherine quietly discussed their impressions of the meeting. Every little detail about Schuyler was analyzed and guarded like a precious treasure. She's got your smile, Alexander commented softly. Catherine smiled through her tears and her intelligent eyes. As they said goodbye in the parking lot, there was a new energy between them. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but now they had hope. Schuyler was no longer just an abstract idea, a painful memory. She was real, vibrant, and wonderful. See you at the next meeting, Catherine asked, hesitating before getting into her car. Alexander nodded, a genuine smile lighting up his face. I wouldn't miss it for the world. As he drove home, Alexander found himself humming along to the radio, something he hadn't done for years. The future was still uncertain, full of legal and emotional challenges. But for the first time in a decade, he felt that his life had a greater purpose than corporate profits and acquisitions. Schuyler was his miracle, his second chance, and he would do everything in his power to be the father she deserved, no matter how long it took or what obstacles he had to overcome. With this thought in mind, Alexander arrived home, eager to plan the next meeting and dream of the day when Schuyler would call him Dad. Autumn arrived in Seattle with an explosion of color and a sharp drop in temperature. The leaves in the city's parks painted a mosaic of reds, oranges, and golds, creating a breathtaking scene. For Alexander Jordan, however, the beauty of autumn was just a backdrop to the drama unfolding in his life. 3 months had passed since his first meeting with Schuyler in the park. 3 months of supervised visits, family therapy sessions, and endless legal negotiations. Every step forward seemed to be accompanied by 2 steps back, and Alexander's patience was being tested to the limit. That Saturday morning, he found himself once again in the office of Evelyn Goldstein, the lawyer who was handling his case. Catherine was at his side, the dark circles under her eyes revealing nights of poor sleep. So, what's the situation? Alexander asked, barely containing the frustration in his voice. Evelyn sighed, adjusting her glasses. Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Mrs. Matthews is more open to the idea of shared custody. The supervised visits have been going well, and she recognizes the positive impact you're having on Schuyler's life. Catherine leaned forward, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. And the bad news? The bad news is that the legal process is still dragging on. The judge wants more psychological assessments, more reports from social workers, and there's the question of the financial compensation that Mrs. Matthews is requesting. Alexander frowned. Financial compensation. She wants money to let us see our own daughter. Evelyn held up a hand in a placating gesture. It's not that simple, Mr. Jordan. Mrs. Matthews has invested years of her life and considerable resources in raising Schuyler. She is asking for compensation for the costs of raising her and to ensure that Schuyler has a substantial education fund. Catherine sighed heavily. How much? She's asking for $2 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander felt a wave of anger surge through his chest, but before it could explode, Catherine put a hand on his arm. Alex, she said softly, think about Schuyler. This isn't about us or Mrs. Matthews. It's about what's best for our daughter. Catherine's words calmed him down, as they always had done lately. Over the last few months, they had grown closer in a way that neither of them had expected. The search for Schuyler had brought them together again, not as a romantic couple, but as partners in a shared mission. Alexander took a deep breath before speaking. Right, money is no object. If that's what we need to do to have Schuyler in our lives, we'll do it. Evelyn nodded, taking notes. Good. I'll communicate that to Mrs. Matthews' lawyer. That should speed up the process considerably. When they left the office, Alexander and Catherine decided to take a walk through Pike Place Market to relax. The famous market was crowded as usual, with vendors shouting out offers of fresh fish and tourists taking pictures of the elaborate flower stalls. "How do you think Skylar would react if she knew about all this legal drama?" Catherine asked as they walked. Alexander shook his head. "Honestly, I have no idea. Sometimes I forget that she's only 10. She seems so mature on our visits." Catherine smiled sadly. "I know. She's amazing, isn't she? So intelligent, so compassionate. Mrs. Matthews did a great job raising her." Alexander nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt. It was hard not to resent Mrs. Matthews sometimes, but he knew he owed her a lot for taking such good care of Skylar. They stopped at a stall selling elaborate bouquets. Catherine gently touched a lily petal. "Skylar loves flowers," she commented. "On her last visit, she told me all the scientific names of the flowers in Mrs. Matthews' garden." Alexander smiled, remembering Skylar's enthusiasm for sharing her knowledge. She has her passion for nature, that's for sure. They bought a small bouquet, planning to take it to Skylar on her next visit. As they continued their walk, Alexander couldn't help noticing how he and Catherine seemed closer now than they had been in years. "Kate," he said softly, "I know things have been difficult, but I'm glad we're going through this together." Catherine looked at him, surprised, before offering a gentle smile. "Me too, Alex. I don't think I could have done it alone." Suddenly, Alexander's phone rang. It was Samantha Ortiz. "Mr. Jordan, we have a situation. Skylar had a crisis at school today. She's asking for you." Alexander's heart raced. "What happened? Is she all right?" "Physically, yes. But emotionally, well, I think this whole situation has finally hit her. Mrs. Matthews has agreed to allow an emergency visit. Can you come to the office now?" Alexander looked at Catherine, who was already nodding vigorously, having overheard part of the conversation. "We'll be there in 20 minutes, he replied, already moving towards the parking lot. The drive to the Department of Children's Services seemed to take forever. When they finally arrived, they found Skylar curled up on a sofa in Samantha's living room, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Skylar," Catherine whispered, running to hug her. To both their surprise and joy, Skylar threw herself into Catherine's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I don't understand," she whimpered. "Why does everything have to be so complicated? Why can't I just have all of you in my life?" Alexander knelt down beside them, placing a comforting hand on Skylar's back. "Oh, darling," he murmured, fighting back his own tears. "We want this too, more than you can imagine." For the next few minutes, they just stood there, embracing, while Skylar vented all the confusion and frustration she had been harboring. Alexander and Catherine exchanged glances over the girl's head, a silent understanding passing between them. When Skylar finally calmed down, Alexander picked up the bouquet they had bought earlier. "Look, we brought this for you," he said softly. "We know how much you love flowers." Skylar's face lit up slightly at the sight of the flowers. "They're beautiful," she whispered, gently touching the petals. "Thank you." Samantha, who had given them their privacy, reappeared in the doorway. "Skylar, darling, Mrs. Matthews is here to pick you up. Are you ready to go?" Skylar hesitated, looking from Alexander to Catherine. Are you leaving again?" Catherine held Skylar's hand. "Not forever, sweetheart. I promise. We're working hard to be able to spend more time with you." Alexander nodded, adding, "And in the meantime, we'll be here whenever you need us, day or night." Skylar hugged them one last time before getting up. "Promise?" "We promise," they replied in unison. As they watched Skylar leave with Mrs. Matthews, Alexander and Catherine felt a mixture of pain and renewed determination. "We need to sort this out," Alexander said, his voice firm. "For Skylar," Catherine nodded, squeezing his hand. "We'll make it happen, Alex, no matter what it takes." As they left the office that evening, they both knew that a new phase had begun. The legal and emotional complexities were still there, but now they had a vivid reminder of what really mattered: Skylar's well-being. Autumn continued outside, the leaves falling gently to the ground. But for Alexander and Catherine, a new spring seemed to be beginning. A spring of hope, of family, and of a future that finally included their precious daughter. Winter in Seattle arrived with surprising ferocity. The city, normally known for its constant rain, was covered in a white blanket of snow, transforming the streets into a postcard scene. For Alexander Jordan, however, the cold outside was nothing compared to the warmth he felt in his heart. 6 months had passed since Skylar's emotional crisis, and things finally seemed to be falling into place. After countless meetings, negotiations, and therapy sessions, they had reached an agreement that seemed to satisfy everyone. Or at least, it was as close as they could get. It was Christmas Eve, and Alexander was nervously tidying up the last details in his house. For the first time, Skylar would be spending the night with him and Catherine. Mrs. Matthews had agreed to allow Skylar to stay with them on Christmas Eve and Christmas morning, before returning to spend the rest of the holiday with her. The sound of the doorbell made Alexander jump. He ran to the door, his heart beating fast. As he opened it, he was greeted by the sight of Skylar, wrapped in a bright red coat, snow melting on her woolly hat. "Hi, Alex," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. It was still strange for him to hear Skylar call him Alex instead of Dad, but he knew he had to be patient. These kinds of changes took time. "Hello, darling," he replied, opening a wide smile. "Come in, it's freezing outside." Skylar walked in, taking off her snow-covered boots. Mrs. Matthews was right behind, carrying a small suitcase. "Mr. Jordan," she greeted formally. "Mrs. Matthews," Alexander replied, trying to maintain a cordial tone. "Please come in for a moment. It's too cold to stand in the doorway." She hesitated for a moment before accepting the invitation. As Skylar ran off to explore the house, Alexander and Mrs. Matthews stood in the doorway, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. "So," Mrs. Matthews began, "what time should I pick you up tomorrow?" "Catherine and I can take her back, if you prefer," Alexander offered. "Around 2 p.m.? Mrs. Matthews nodded slowly. "That's fine. Skylar has all her things, including the presents for you. Please make sure she takes her allergy medication before bed." Alexander felt a pang of guilt. There were so many things about Skylar's day-to-day life that he still didn't know. "Of course, I'll do that. Thank you for giving us this time with her." For a moment, Mrs. Matthews' cold facade seemed to melt a little. "She's happy, Mr. Jordan. That's all I ever wanted for her." Before Alexander could reply, Skylar came running back. "Mom, you have to see the Christmas tree. It's huge." Mrs. Matthews smiled softly. "I'm sure it's beautiful, dear. But I have to go now. Be good to Alexander and Catherine, okay? And call if you need anything." Skylar hugged Mrs. Matthews tightly. "I'll miss you, Mom. But I'll have fun, I promise." After Mrs. Matthews left, Alexander joined Skylar in the living room, where an imposing Christmas tree dominated the space. "What do you think?" he asked, eager for her approval. Skylar turned slowly, absorbing every detail. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I've never seen such a big tree indoors." Alexander laughed. "Well, it's a special occasion. Our first Christmas Eve together deserves a special tree." Just then, the front door opened again and Catherine walked in, laden with bags. "Sorry I'm late," she called out. "Traffic's terrible with all this snow." Skylar ran to help her, picking up some of the bags. "What's all this, Catherine?" Catherine smiled mysteriously. "Just a few surprises for our special night." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. They baked gingerbread cookies, watched classic Christmas movies, and even had a quick snowball fight in the backyard. For Alexander and Catherine, every moment was precious. Every laugh from Skylar a gift they had feared they would never receive. In the evening, as they sat around the fireplace, Skylar suddenly became serious. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander and Catherine exchanged worried glances. "Of course, dear," Catherine replied. "What is it?" Skylar played with the hem of her sweater for a moment before speaking. What was it like when I was a baby?" Before, you know. The silence that followed was heavy. Alexander felt his heart squeeze, but he knew that Skylar deserved the truth. "You were the most precious thing in the world to us, Skylar," he began softly. "So small, so perfect. I remember holding you for the first time in the hospital. You gripped my finger so tightly. I knew at that moment that I would do anything to protect you." Catherine continued, tears shining in her eyes. "You had the sweetest smile, and you were curious about everything, always reaching for things, always wanting to explore." Skylar listened to them attentively, absorbing every word. "So, what happened? Why did we split up?" Alexander took a deep breath. They had discussed with Dr. Chen how to approach this subject, but it was still difficult. "There was an accident, dear," he explained gently. "A car accident. We thought we'd lost you forever. It was the worst day of our lives." Catherine took Skylar's hand. "But now we know it was a miracle. Somehow, you survived. And even though we lost all those years, we're so grateful to have you back in our lives." Skylar was silent for a long moment, processing everything. Then, to both their surprise, she stood up and hugged them. "I love Mrs. Matthews," she said softly. "She's my mother, but I'm happy to have you too. It's like having an extra family." Alexander felt the tears streaming down his face, not ashamed to show them. "We love you so much, Skylar, more than you can imagine." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of emotions and newly formed connections. When it was finally time for bed, Skylar asked them both to read her a story, something she hadn't done for years, but which felt right on that special night. Later, after Skylar had fallen asleep, Alexander and Catherine sat in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, watching the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree. "Can you believe it?" Catherine whispered. "After all this time, all this suffering, she's here. With us." Alexander nodded, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced for years. "It's a Christmas miracle, isn't it?" Catherine smiled, raising her glass. "The Jordan family, together again." They toasted silently, the soft sounds of Skylar's breathing coming from the next room, the best Christmas present they could have asked for. While the snow continued to fall outside, covering Seattle in a silent white blanket, inside Alexander's house, a new chapter was beginning. A family, once torn apart by fate, now reunited, learning to navigate their new realities and relationships. It was a new beginning, full of promise and possibility. And as the clock struck midnight, officially announcing Christmas, Alexander made a silent promise. No matter what the future held, he would do everything in his power to keep his family together, to be the father Skylar deserved, and to never again take for granted the precious gift that was love. Christmas had brought more than material gifts. It had brought the gift of second chances, redemption, and hope. And for the Jordan family, newly reunited and still learning to reconnect, it was the beginning of a wonderful and exciting journey, a journey they would take together, one day at a time. Summer arrived in Seattle with an explosion of color and life. The city's parks were full of people enjoying the rare sunshine, and the air was charged with the scent of flowers in full bloom. For Alexander Jordan, however, the real beauty was indoors, where the sounds of laughter and animated conversation filled every room. It was Skylar's 11th birthday, and Alexander's house was full of guests, friends from school, neighbors, and, of course, family. Catherine was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches to the birthday cake, while Mrs. Matthews was helping to organize the presents in the living room. Alexander watched everything with a smile on his face, still hardly believing how much his life had changed in the last year and a half. The journey hadn't been easy, but every challenge, every obstacle overcome, had been worth it to get to this moment. "Alex, come and see what Grandma got me!" Skylar's excited voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Skylar running towards him, holding an old photo album. Catherine's mother, whom Skylar now affectionately called Grandma, was smiling from the sofa. "What have you got there, dear?" Alexander asked, kneeling down to be at her eye level. Skylar opened the album, revealing photos of her as a baby. "Look, it's me, and you and Catherine. I mean, Mom and Dad." Alexander's heart leapt. Skylar still alternated between calling him and Catherine by their names and Mom and Dad, but each time she used the familiar terms, it was like music to his ears. "Wow, this is amazing," he said, flipping through the pages with her. "Look how tiny you were." Mrs. Matthews approached, a gentle smile on her face. "She's grown up so much since then, hasn't she?" There was a moment of tension, as there always was when past and present collided in this way. But then, to everyone's surprise, Skylar hugged Mrs. Matthews and Alexander at the same time. "I'm very lucky," she declared. "I have 3 parents who love me." Tears glistened in the eyes of all the adults present. Catherine, who had just come out of the kitchen carrying the cake, smiled through her own tears. "It's time to sing Happy Birthday," she announced, trying to keep her voice steady. Everyone gathered around the dining room table, where the cake was placed, the candles were lit, and the traditional Happy Birthday song filled the air. Skylar closed her eyes for a moment, clearly making a request, before blowing out the candles with a big smile. Applause and shouts of joy echoed around the room. As Catherine began to cut the cake, Alexander noticed Evelyn Goldstein, her lawyer, talking quietly to Mrs. Matthews in a corner. He approached, curious. "Is everything all right?" he asked, a touch of concern in his voice. Evelyn smiled reassuringly. "More than fine, actually. Mrs. Matthews and I were discussing the last details of the shared custody agreement." Mrs. Matthews nodded, a look of peace on her face that Alexander had rarely seen before. "I think we've finally arrived at an arrangement that works for all of us. And more importantly, an arrangement that's best for Skylar." Alexander felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. I don't know what to say. Thank you. For everything." Mrs. Matthews held out her hand, which Alexander shook without hesitation. "We're a family now, Mr. Jordan. An unconventional family, perhaps, but a family nonetheless." The moment was interrupted by Skylar, who came running with a piece of cake. "You have to try it. Mom Catherine did an amazing job." The 3 adults laughed, the tension of the previous months finally dissipating completely. As the party continued, Alexander found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. He remembered that rainy night, almost 2 years ago, when he had met a little girl hitchhiking. At the time, he couldn't have imagined how that simple act of kindness would change his life forever. Later, as the guests began to leave and the house became quieter, Alexander found Skylar sitting on the backyard swing, gazing thoughtfully at the evening sky. "Hey, birthday girl," he said softly, taking a seat next to her. "What are you thinking about?" Skylar smiled, a smile so reminiscent of Catherine's. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am. You know, at school, lots of kids have divorced parents and complicated families. But mine is complicated in a good way." Alexander felt his heart fill with love and pride. "You're a very wise girl, you know that." Skylar shrugged, but her smile widened. "Hey, Alex, you mean Dad?" "Yes, dear. Thanks for finding me that night. Thanks for not giving up." Alexander pulled Skylar into a tight hug, silent tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, my dear. You brought us back to life." They stood there, swaying gently, as the sun set over the horizon. From inside the house, they could hear the voices of Catherine and Mrs. Matthews, laughing about some old story. Alexander reflected on how unpredictable life could be. 2 years ago, he was a lonely businessman, focused only on his next big deal. Now, he was part of a unique and wonderful family, with a daughter he loved more than life itself. The future would still bring challenges, he knew. There would be discussions about rules and timetables, debates about schools and extracurricular activities. There would be moments of doubt and moments of frustration, but there would also be love, lots of love. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Alexander made a silent promise. He promised always to cherish these moments, always to put his family first and always. always to be grateful for the miracle that had brought Skylar back into his life. "Shall we go in?" he suggested gently. "I think we still have some presents to open." Skylar jumped up excitedly, pulling him by the hand. "Come on! I want to show Mommy Ellen the science book you and Mommy Catherine gave me." As they made their way back to the house, Alexander felt a deep peace settle in his heart. The cycle was complete. The family he thought he had lost forever had not only been found, but had grown into something even more beautiful and precious. And there, in that house full of love and laughter, with his miraculous daughter by his side and two extraordinary women he now considered family waiting for them, Alexander Jordan knew he had finally found the true meaning of happiness. The millionaire who once saved a young girl by hitchhiking in the rain not only found his lost daughter, but also found himself, and in the process, created a family that defied all conventions, but was rich in love, understanding, and second chances. And so, as night fell over Seattle, the story of Alexander, Catherine, Mrs. Matthews, and above all, Skylar continued to unfold, proving that sometimes the happiest endings come from the most unexpected beginnings.